Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Gloria Cecilia wash processed Colombia from Thankfully Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Thankfully, based out of Auburn, Alabama, and they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on several occasions, including a recent review of the Santiago Lachiguiri, a wash processed Mexican coffee. And in the name of transparency, I'd actually purchased this coffee alongside that one. However, Thankfully Coffee did send me a replacement bag as they felt like they could have improved from their initial release of that coffee. And I'd actually been in discussions with Thankfully Coffee for a while about their release of Giroso coffees, and this is the one that sounded the most in line with my own preferences. So I've been aware of this coffee before its initial release, and it's a coffee that I was very curious to try for myself. So it's going to be interesting to see how it's turned out, as this right here is day 40. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe in a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So Thankfully Coffee once again does roast slightly lighter than a lot of other American coffee roasters out there. This one does feel a little lighter than that Santiago Lachiguiri, and I feel like they were really working on trying to get the profile of this one right. Even then, I wouldn't necessarily say that this is the lightest roasting coffee roaster out there, as I feel like a lot of people would still most closely align this one with being on the lighter side of a light medium in terms of that roast profile. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the first and most noticeable thing about this coffee was an interesting spiced quality at the forefront, but it is followed up by a subtle peachy aspect as well, some slight sugary qualities to complement an otherwise softer cup, but for the most part it was a nicer start, and that spiced quality at the forefront of the coffee is something that I'm going to discuss a little bit more throughout this, as it was a very consistent and ever-present theme within this one. Day 18 through the Chemex, and it's offering plenty of similarities with some better intensity and definition to it. Spice quality ever present yet again at the forefront, but the cool down is offering a little bit more of a graham cracker-like aspect to complement the peachiness. Subtle citric aspect as well, lending itself towards another nice day. Day 21 through the April brewer, and it's a bit more toned down relative to some of the previous days, but the theme remains the same, as it has this pastry-like quality to complement some of these subtle fruit qualities as well. It's been pretty straightforward. It's been pretty consistent even across the brew methods. Day 24, we opted for the V60 with Thankfully Coffee's recipe, and their recipe isn't too dissimilar from our own, as they do go with slightly lower temperatures, but not by much, 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit difference, as it continues to remain consistent and straightforward with a slight spiced quality at the forefront, followed yet again by the graham cracker-like pastry aspect, and a little bit more of the peachy and slightly citric qualities again. There's a very subtle mint to it as well, but for the most part, the other aspects of this one have been just pretty present, prominent, pronounced, and consistent in this one. Day 27 through the Chemex with Thankfully Coffee's recipe, and it continues to remain very consistent with the spiced quality continuing to be the primary focus right at the beginning of this coffee, with much more of this peach or cobbler-like feel to it at the back end. A slight florality, this time in line with the honeysuckle-like scents, but it's buried underneath what I would describe as being some of the more pronounced characteristics within this coffee. Day 30 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and there really isn't too much to add, as it continues to remain extremely straightforward with that spice quality followed by that peach cobbler-like feel. If there's one thing I do have to say about this coffee, it's that it's pretty well structured. You get that right off brew at the very forefront, and even then, as the cup has cooled down, you're still kind of experiencing that before you feel a little bit more of that pastry-like feel to this coffee. Day 33 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and this was by far the best it had been to this point, as it's offering just a slight bit more sweetness in terms of that pastry sense, and given that that was one of the, I would say, more unique and defining characteristics of this coffee relative to other coffees in general, it's something that I did want to accentuate maybe a little bit more. In addition to that, the spiced quality is slightly toned down relative to some of the more intense fruit aspects of it, including a slight caramelized sweetness as well, lending itself towards a better experience. Day 37, one more try through the Chemex, and there's more consistency, though there's a slight bit more of the spiced quality today, which I can say has been something that, for the most part, was extremely consistent, with the exception of the one day where it was perhaps a little bit toned down. It still seems to have dissipated relative to the other earlier experiences, but it's still present nonetheless. outside of that, little difference from any of the other previous experiences we'd had of this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a number of level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that this one was going to score the level 4 in terms of the cleanliness. There's nothing to really take away from it. There's no funkiness, fermentiness, any of those things that would really hinder the overall cleanliness of this coffee. It's very much the epitome of a true level 4, as there's nothing that sets it over the top and nothing that seems to, I guess we'll say, hinder it. Finish, level 4. And the finish, it's slightly sugary, but that being said, I would say is a little bit more even. It does offer a slight citric quality. For the most part, it's just consistent, and I don't want to say nothing out of the ordinary in terms of the finish, but that's just kind of the best way I can describe it. It has a slight bit of the sugariness in the finish, and then that's just kind of the best direction to say with that one. Sweetness, level 4. Perhaps a slight bit generous. I don't necessarily think this is the sweetest coffee out there. It does offer, I would say, some slightly sugary aspects that do maybe push it slightly over the top. But for me, lower side of level 4, because I don't necessarily think it was ever intended to be the most abundantly sweet coffee out there. Stone fruit, level 4, and while the peach cobbler-like aspect is something that I continue to discuss quite a bit, I would say that it may be also still on the slightly lower side of level 4. The main reason it did reach that level 4 is because it is the most pronounced characteristic within this coffee. It's also one of the more consistent characteristics as well. Even then, I don't necessarily think it ever comes out as a true peachiness. It always seems to be complemented by either the graham cracker-like quality that gives it that peach cobbler, peach apple pie, peach pie sort of feel to it. So for that reason, yeah, it's level 4, but maybe not necessarily a true ripe, peachy, stone fruit sort of peach. And then we have a number of level 3s. We will start with the acidity level 3. Not necessarily the brightest coffee, and I'm not entirely sure what to make of that, though going into it, I didn't necessarily expect it to be the brightest coffee. We're just working with a standard wash process Colombian Chirroso, so it would have been really surprising to me did it reach anything above that level. Florality, level 3, and I mentioned briefly that there's a honeysuckle-like aspect. They have floral listed on here, and once again, I can see that, and maybe because it comes a little bit more in that kind of pastry-like sense where there's a little bit of a florality to that. But outside of that, the honeysuckle was the best descriptor I could find in line with that. Spice, level 3. All right, let's discuss the spice quality. So when I initially decided that this is the Chirroso coffee from Thankfully Coffee that I actually wanted to try, I was given a little bit of a forewarning that this coffee might have a slight bit of a black pepper-like component to it. And I feel like if you look at other iterations of this coffee and also the descriptor of this coffee itself, then it does insinuate that that's something that you might be experiencing from it. And for me, I wouldn't necessarily say it was black pepper. If I'm being completely honest, what it reminded me a little bit of was the aroma of pencil shavings. And that's the best way I could describe that spice-like quality. But even then, it's a little bit more subtle. As you can see, it's scoring that level 3. But that being said, it's something that I want to be completely honest and transparent about. And it is the thing that I had experienced in terms of that spice-like quality that I think a lot of people align with being black pepper. And then we have the caramel level 3. As I kind of mentioned, there's a lot of those sugary aspects to it. And at some time, they can come out in a little bit more of a caramelized sense as well. So that's where that comes into play. Savoriness, level 3. And I think that's the quote-unquote buttery quality that they have in here. Oftentimes, I more associate that with texture, but given that it's a little bit more of a sweeter, buttery pastry quality to it, I think that the savoriness does seem to go well with that. And then the final thing worth discussing is the body of the level 2. And I think that's a little bit of a component of brewing this one with the Chemex, so truth be told, I wouldn't necessarily say that this has the most amount of body throughout. So level 2 does seem like a pretty good place to put it. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I know Thankfully Coffee would want me to be as brutally honest and transparent about this coffee as possible. And while I did like it, I think there are a couple of things that might have held it back. The first of which is expectation, because it very much sounded like a type of coffee that I was going to enjoy. And while I did enjoy it, I think my expectations based off previous experiences with this coffee roaster was that it might turn out a little bit better than I was expecting. And given that they were tinkering with the profile to get this coffee really the best that it could be, I still felt like it was pretty similar to some of the initial impressions that I had had of the other coffee that I'd had in terms of the Gloria Cecilia. So that being said, it was maybe hindered by a little bit of the expectations, but the honest reality is this coffee was just so consistent and straightforward that while I was still trying to maybe obtain some more qualities from it, it offered the same profile throughout. And there's something to be said for consistency. I know a lot of people really enjoy consistency within their coffee, but for me, I was maybe hoping for a little bit more because this coffee was straightforward every single time. Every cup I had was very similar, and there were very subtle and slight differences throughout, but I'm really looking for something that maybe offered a little bit more than just what was presented throughout the entirety of this coffee. Type of person I would suggest this one to, though. First place I would start is if you like a little bit more of those subtle, slightly sugary, peach cobbler-like qualities, which I do, and that's why at the end of the day I still enjoyed this coffee. But that's the first place I would start with somebody for this one. In addition to that, I do have to say a very consistent cup of coffee, because once again, the notes are extremely consistent right from the onset and throughout the entirety of this one. And while we didn't tinker or adjust with it too much, I do have to say that the notable adjustments, like the differences in brewers, didn't necessarily seem to change this coffee too much. So I think for that reason, you're going to be experiencing a very consistent coffee throughout the entirety of it. That's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Gloria Cecilia wash process Colombia from Thankfully Coffee. Thank you for watching.